Well, welcome back, everyone, to Security Weekly's virtual hacker summer camp. I am Paul Asadorian, and I'm here with Chris Morales. He's the principal security advisor at Vectra AI. Chris, welcome.
Glad to be here. Well, virtually here, right? We're still on the other side of the country from each other.
That's right. Virtually here. It's not your first time on the show. We did an interview at a previous conference at some point.
No, it was the last time was right before InfoSec World for that, going down to the one down in Disney World just last year, I think, actually.
Yeah. Awesome. Nice to have you back.
In person.
Yeah, and we'll do it virtually because, that's the way the world is working today, is virtually. And you wanted to talk today about observing privilege to reduce risk in SaaS services. It's a great topic, though. It's all about identity.
It is, and it's all about us working at home and the fact that that's all we got anymore.
Right. Well, and SaaS is just such a different animal. I feel like the same security principles still apply, but they're just done very differently, right? Because we don't have access to all of the nitty gritty stuff. Like a lot of what we have revolves around identity.
Well, you know what's really interesting about that? So it used to be pretty simple when all the laptops were on a network and, so you phish somebody, phishing is still the thing, that you get on somebody's laptop and then you just start kind of hopping around and scanning. Well, now people are on home networks. If you actually think about that from the inside of the network or whatever the hell that is now, what are you going to scan for? Other people's iPads, their Roku, other things. You're not actually getting the same ability to go from machine to machine from a user anymore. So you have to start thinking about what the connectivity is, and it's actually cloud apps, and in particular for most people, it's Office 365, right? I mean, I assume you're using cloud mail, cloud storage, all that stuff, right?
Yeah, we actually use G Suite.
All right, well, you're probably safe because no one cares.
Yeah, right? Because the enterprises, you're right, are mostly the Office 365. Azure Active Directory is certainly catching on.
Yeah. Have you heard of something called Power Automate?
No, I haven't.
I didn't until a few weeks ago either, ironically. And it's just because having to really learn about the environment. And everybody's heard of PowerShell, which is hacker tool number one, administrator tool number one. It turns out that Microsoft has a Office 365 alternative called Power Automate. And I think you should go look for it. It's enabled by default in Office. And it's really cool. Just like PowerShell, it lets you do exactly what it says. Script things, move things to a OneDrive, for example, or copy to it, or open list. It literally lets you execute and automate actions in Office, and it's on everywhere. And it's got this really slick UI that you can kind of configure and set things up.
Yeah, it's interesting. The endpoint just becomes a vehicle to gain access to maybe the user's identity, but then pivot into, not like you said, other systems on the network. Especially now that everyone's at home using cloud apps, they're pivoting into the cloud using what are now newer techniques, right? In basically, because your network is in the cloud, that's where they're gravitating towards, and tools that can manipulate data, just as they would in a local network. Now it's just on someone else's systems and network, basically.
Yeah, no, it's exactly. And it's because now the desktop has a limited shelf time, basically a limited lifetime of value. And it's as long as it's connected to some kind of resources or network, where cloud accounts like your email are actually always connected, and they're connected everywhere. So you got this thing now, and MITRE actually made a new behavior for this in their attack lifecycle. And they took spear phishing, but now I forget whatever the numbers are behind it, but it's internal spear phishing. So it's the same thing, except it's spear phishing from an already compromised account, and it's the same thing of trying to go from a lower privilege to a higher privilege. Yeah. Except now you're doing it to your coworkers.
Right. Whereas before, we may find systems on the network, get user level privileges, and then escalate, right? Now we're just doing the same thing with identities in these cloud services, basically.
Right. And now you're talking about account takeover. So there's this interesting thing where it's you now get into this privilege problem where is privileged access trusted access? And the fast answer is no, actually. And we've already seen that, like with Twitter, for example, just to go pick on somebody recent.
Right.
You start to think about where these accounts are being used from, who's using them. And I'm picking on Office 365, but this is pervasive across all cloud services like Twitter or AWS or Azure. It's everywhere. And all administrators are at home now. Everybody's working at home. And everybody always says, well, just deal with the access management, et cetera. And they do, but it doesn't matter. First of all, I was an IT admin once, like early on in my life, and I realized when somebody came and asked you for permissions and they were an engineering group, all you did is looked at the last guy you gave permissions to and copied them, but you never really took into account things like, oh, well, he used to be in finance and he joined engineering. That might be a stretch, but that kind of thing happens, right?
Yeah, and those permissions and roles tend to carry over, certainly, right? As we just copy and paste basically between objects, right? And that it has that carryover kind of effect. And the attackers are just cycling through and just trying to escalate privileges, taking advantage of that misuse of role-based access control.
Yeah, and it's in the cloud. That's all that's left. There's really, if you take a management plane, there's no network. Sometimes there's no users. Like if you think of some of the privileged tokens, like what happened to Capital One, there's just access and who's accessing what and accessing from where. So what we've started thinking about is observed privilege instead of known static privilege, which, where last time I was on the show, I talked a lot about supervised, unsupervised deep learning, all these machine learning techniques. One of the key things that we really honed in for an unsupervised perspective is learning entities, services, and location, so that you can start to understand who uses what from where and when. Like you start to ask all these questions. What we learned is that another thing since then, we've been working on this idea of privileged access specifically versus all access. Really, privileged accounts are the ones that kill you. We've learned that you can actually start to score privilege based on the behaviors they have. And you get into all these dimensions of like how many things they access, how many places they do it from. You can start to see who has lots of privilege and who has no privilege. And a perfect example, by the way, is just not administrative. Like the CFO and the CEO might have access to some finance records on a company. That's privileged access. That's like single resource, single person, right? And you have to know that. And you have to understand what that looks like and who has access and where from. That the machine can actually teach you all this stuff so that you can start to trigger and see those deviations to start knowing you had a change in privilege access. And it's either a change in who had the access, what they accessed, or where they accessed from, and what services they used. So that you start to see these different patterns of, I saw in the Twitter one's a perfect example. I call that privileged access from unknown host or unknown location, right? Like this is an external user, I guess a 17-year-old. Did he live near you, Paul? Did you know this kid?
No. But was he from the New England area?
I thought you were in Florida for some reason.
No, I'm not.
Okay. No, it was a Florida person. I just picked on Florida.
That's okay. So. People pick on Florida. It's cool. But the advantage in Office 365, as an example, is in similar systems, there's a central point for authentication and authorization that you can monitor and apply the even unsupervised, right, machine learning type things to detect this kind of thing. And that's something I don't think we really talk about very often, is that it does in a Microsoft environment, depending on which directory service flavor you're using, whether it's on-prem or Azure AD, there's a central place that governs all of this that you can monitor. Is that how this technology is working?
Yeah, and it's what? So we've always been, we're network detection response primarily, and we're always looking for communication between entities, hosts, and things. In the cloud, there's no network, especially in SaaS in particular, there's no network. But there is a management plane, and that management plane produces logs, which are a lot more reliable than an endpoint log, because we always get into this whole endpoint thing that somebody can cover their tracks and change it. On a management plane, it's a lot more stable, and that's not really happening. But those audit logs coming out of the management planes of SaaS apps, it could be it Office 365 or be it Salesforce or even AWS management plane. These management planes do have logs and activity and details of what occurred. Some are better than others, of course. Now, Microsoft has been a pretty security kind of minded company that they have pretty rich logs on what occurs and how these connectivity. So you can just consume that data and then consume data from things like AD, such either cloud AD or on-premise AD. It doesn't actually matter where, but you can start to get the account information. You can start to get the authentication. You can see what those accounts, how they're used, and start to map this out and build it.
And that crosses applications and users, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's important, right? Because, I mean, to use Matt's analogy, it's about apps, users, and data, right? A lot of those other layers are being abstracted away, and that's what we have left to work with. And being able to correlate all that data and detect anomalies, I think, is how you're going to detect attackers today.
Yeah, well, the data comes into it, but the fact is the privilege access happens before the data is accessed. So that becomes the layer. And we've been working, so pre-COVID, this is something we've already been working on. Our timing is such that we actually brought this to market end of last year before all this happened, and we had built for Office 365. Coincidentally, that's become a thing that we've pivoted heavily into because that's what people started asking for, obviously, right? Kind of good timing for us, to be honest. In a way, I mean, I guess that's the way the market was going, but we didn't foresee the lockdown.
Yeah, and that basically pushed this issue right into the forefront of where everyone needs to be.
Yeah, and it's and that's the thing. We've been carefully studying access patterns in Office 365, account takeover, internal spear phishing. As I said, I've learned about things about, look at how you can use Power Automate instead of PowerShell to move around and start to do things within accounts and move data. And it's really interesting that your SaaS becomes your lateral movement and the way that people connect to each other in their accounts and how you can hop from account to account instead of machines. So we're removing machines and the network from the equation, but we're still doing network detection response on the communication in the cloud. It's kind of an interesting concept, and we just redefine what network means.
Yeah, and that's really interesting too, because some of the attacks I've observed are the attackers take over an account and then use private messaging and encryption that's built into those SaaS resources to then phish users or get someone to click on a link or something like that. But the whole message is encrypted, right? And if you're in that management plane and correlating those logs, it's actually a really good usage of that data.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. So we always talk about this moving away from malware. When you get into SaaS, you really move away from malware. There is no more malware. It's literally just using the functions of administration in the cloud and the things handed to the account, and it's manipulating accounts and moving around. Like, you really do move away from this very binary, like, oh, I see something malicious there. And it gets more into these little definitions of like, oh, is that person in the other, like, am I in Florida? No, I'm in Oakland right now. Am I accessing my OneDrive in the middle of the night from this computer? Like, you have to start asking those questions. Like, where are people really, especially when no one's going to work?
Yeah, absolutely. So how does this platform kind of work? Just talk a little bit about, like, if I have Office 365, I want this visibility. Like, what does my deployment and things look like?
Oh, well, it's, the beauty of cloud is it's cloud. It's software as a service. That's the irony. It's software as a service watching software as a service. There's more complex. If it's all you care about is watching Office 365, it's as simple as turning on a few things, plugging in some modules, and then it works. But what we really actually still care about is hybrid environments, because there is no such thing, even with the remote work, it's still not a pure cloud environment. So from a hybrid, we've built it where you can have sensors watching underlying Azure, like virtual sensors watching the hypervisor or AWS, or things on virtual servers in a physical data center, or just the network fabric itself with physical sensors, and then the cloud sensors watching the SaaS apps. You put all that together into a single brain, and it's actually taking traffic from all these locations and stitching it together to start to get a full life cycle view. That's really awesome.
Anything else you want to share with our audience, Chris, about this particular technology and challenge that we all have today?
No, other than it's something we've spent the last couple of years working on this concept of privilege access, because there was a lot of work. There's a lot of data science that went into this. We've got the foundations in place, and we've done this whole scoring system, and we've already built the foundations for cloud. The only thing I can say is, like, we're on an accelerated rate now to just cover. So the thing about SaaS apps is you got to take from every log, but because we built the architecture, we're able to just start adding things really quickly now.
That's awesome. Folks can learn more at vectra.ai/O365. Chris, thank you very much for appearing on Security Weekly.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.
With that, I think that's our last micro interview for today. Stay tuned. Shows coming up next and 2 more full days of recording.